Good afternoon, good morning, actually, because we do this webinar in English, and despite it's about France and Europe, but also for audience west of Europe. So welcome. This is the France Gets Ready on the DSA. This is a webinar co-organized by the Trust and Safety Forum, which is an associated event of the FIC, the International Cybersecurity Forum. We do it together with Renaissance Numérique, a French think tank. We have the executive director with us. We may hear from him later today. And we are welcoming three guests. So we have Benoit Loutrel, who is a board member of ARCOM, the French regulator. We will then hear from Jean-Sébastien Mariez, who is now we see the slides that's coming up. Jean-Sébastien Mariez, who is attorney, a partner of the law firm Momentum Avocats, and specialized on trust and safety issues. And we'll have the last speaker, Louis-Victor de Franssu, who is CEO, founder of Tremau, a trust and safety solution provider. So the purpose of this meeting, and actually we will, this session is in kind of a preview of another session we'll do at the FIC on the 5th of April at the Trust and Safety Forum. The purpose of this session is to really give you another sight on the DSA. As the DSA is a massive instrument of regulation for the EU for platforms and search engines. There was a lot of discussion about this. It's a complex text. And so we thought it would be useful to give you a kind of overview on what it means. So we have a three-steps approach. We'll start by Benoit Loutrel from ARCOM, who will give you a kind of inside view of what will be the role of the regulator about this text. And you will see it's quite a lot. So in a way, you will get a big picture from Benoit. Then we'll go slightly deeper in the text with Jean-Sébastien, who will give you the kind of more specific view on the obligations and requirements resulting from the DSA. And then we will move to the implementation phase. When you know, okay, we enter the big picture, you understand what you have to do, then how do you do it? And this is what Louis-Victor will cover. So with this, this session is, as I said, in English, or despite we are all French, but we wanted to maximize the access from international audience, as France will lead an important role in this implementation of this regulation. So apologies for those who were expecting a French session. And then without any further ado, so I will hand over to Benoit, so board member of ARCOM, the French regulator, for the big picture.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Welcome everybody today. As explained, I will try to get you through the big picture because clearly it's a complex text. You have, guess what, 98 articles, more than several hundreds of considering. But at the end of the day, the intent of the policymakers was pretty clear. The DSA was built to reintroduce a strong focus on the EU fundamental rights in platforms. Platforms have had an incredible success in the EU, like in the US or elsewhere in the world. This success was based on the limited liability scheme, which was enshrined in the e-commerce directive. And clearly, the intent of the policymakers were to bring back a stronger focus on the fundamental rights while protecting the platform, because clearly platforms are a success and there is no intention from EU policymakers to challenge the success of the platform, but rather to say that this success called for greater responsibility. So what DSA is really doing is reaffirming the limited liability scheme of intermediaries that was included in e-commerce. Reaffirming it because in the e-commerce directive, this scheme was translated in national laws. So it's the same thing everywhere, but slightly different everywhere in each country. So with the DSA, the limited liability scheme is directly in EU law and will be applicable exactly the same way everywhere in Europe. So clearly, it's a strong message of platform saying we want to provide the security, legal security for the platform to be sure that you can continue to develop. But of course, it's also adding some new responsibilities. And basically, the key messages, if you want to understand what is DSA about, is saying trust and safety used to be a good thing to have, good for business. Maybe it was part of the environmental and social responsibility of the ESR. Now it will be a legal requirement. Important thing is that the philosophy is it will be implemented through compliance, meaning we'll have obligation of means, but the means won't be specified by the regulators. You will still enjoy some freedom, so you will continue to have the capacity to innovate, to bring new schemes. We'll still have the capacity to have new platforms. If you think your future is in the metaverse, the DSA is metaverse proof. We'll just have a different reading of it, but you have built-in flexibility. And this is important. Flexibility, there was a willingness to both strengthen the regulation, strengthen the regulatory requirement while keeping this flexibility. That's why the new ingredients is that you have part of the text is a toolbox for regulators, so that the regulators can step in and use this toolbox to adapt it to specific requirement, to new development of the market, to the metaverse coming in maybe at some point. So that's also why some people are troubled saying, but I read the DSA and I think it's somewhat blurred. I don't understand exactly what I will be required, because that part maybe is a toolbox part. So it's tools that will be available for regulators. And until regulators have started giving a purpose to those tools, you will not have the full understanding, of course. So that's a key element, I guess. Another thing which is extremely important is that the DSA was designed taking into account the experience learned from the GDPR. And so that we can decide, GDPR is also a regulation which was about protecting fundamental rights. And there was the idea that we have lessons to learn so that we can both defend fundamental rights, but also be business friendly and try to be extremely relevant and flexible. Three differences from between the GDPR, or lessons that have been learned from the GDPR. DSA is not a one-size-fits-all. You don't have the same requirement for everybody. The greater you are, the more commercial success you have, the greater responsibility you have. You are still small, trying to develop, you have less stringent requirements. So it's a tiered system where clearly and proportional to the economic success you have. First. Second thing, the GDPR started on day one for everybody, which was somewhat of a challenge for public authorities also to give explanation and to cope with the fact that the whole economy had to suddenly to comply with GDPR. In the DSA, we start with the big players. The big players will be the one on which we will learn how to implement DSA, and they will bear the cost of the early days of the DSA. And then in 2024, it will apply to everybody, everywhere in Europe, all platforms. At least all platforms targeting Europe, because in fact, it will apply also to platforms which are not based in Europe, but still are operating in Europe or targeting European consumers. The third thing is the governance of the regulatory function. In GDPR, it's a pure country of origin governance scheme. So you know the rule. The regulators in the country where you are established will have the capacity to enforce the regulation. So it's a scheme where Ireland and Luxembourg are de facto regulating for the whole of Europe, which is somewhat tricky in some cases. With the DSA, you have a new scheme where you have really a network of regulators with the EU Commission in the center. And the big players, which will be subject to the most stringent requirement, will be under direct supervision by the EU Commission. And medium and smaller player will be under the country of origin principle. So you have really a balanced system where you have the EU Commission, the country of origin regulator who still play a key role, but also all the regulators of the country of destination can participate in the regulation. And you have a very strong governance scheme where clearly on all the requirements, the EU Commission at the center, with a board of digital services, where you will have all the national regulators being present, will have the capacity to issue guidelines to be sure that we have a consistent implementation across Europe. So clearly, you will have a very strong coherence across Europe as we implement the DSA. So I guess that's the big picture. And no, last thing, sorry. So I started saying, what is the regulation about? Bringing the fundamental rights back in the picture. Practically, it means enforcing, setting regulations for the trust and safety function. So basically, the trust and safety function, it's the fact that in this regulation, you have an obligation of diligence, where you have to take care of your client, basically, in a nutshell, and a transparency requirement very strong to make sure that everybody understands how the platform operates, which is strategic for to create trust in the system. I'll stop there. If you have a trust and safety function, most likely you will just have to wonder how you will report on how good you are at implementing it. If you don't have one at this point, you may start thinking, calling in an external advisor. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Before I hand over to Sébastien, I would have just a question, or just your what you said about when we prepared this meeting. You said something that was interesting. You said that when you read the DSA, you actually, I mean, you can't understand the DSA just by reading it, because of all what you said on the fact that a lot will happen. There is a lot of flexibility. And could you say, just to refine maybe your point, is the role of regulators? That's actually, there is quite unusually, there is room for regulators to shape the future. Also, like metaverse, I mean, things do not exist, of course, that will have to be implemented, but it sounds like a shift of the role of regulators, or at least an evolution. Is this right? I mean, is this the first time that regulators will have quite room for interpretation, or is this something that has been?
I guess
another.
If your reference is the e-commerce directive, it's completely new. In the e-commerce directive, you don't have regulators. So the e-commerce directive was drafted very precisely so that at the end, a judge can interpret it directly. If you compare it to what we had in telecommunication, which is the closest thing to the digital industry, it's nothing new. In the electronic communication directive, the electronic communication code, you have the same thing, the fact that you have regulators at the center, and they're really provided with an incredibly rich toolbox in which they can pick and choose instrument to achieve specific goals that are set in the directive. So the model is not new from that point of view at all. If you compare it to GDPR, it's a mix. GDPR is the same for everybody. So you don't have this toolbox part in a way. You also have regulators. So yes, it's more innovative than GDPR in that sense. It's a new. I guess you can be surprised if you compare it to GDPR, because part of the instruments that are included in the text, you don't. It's difficult, honestly, I recognize, to interpret it without discussing with the regulators. Take the example of the most stringent requirement for very large online platforms. They are required to go through risk assessment. The risk assessment, you may have one or two considering explaining what it is. It's not sufficient. Then you will have to work with the EU Commission. The EU Commission will come back saying how they expect the risk assessment to take place. And as we move forward, a pattern will appear, a culture of regulation will appear. And yes, at this point, you cannot understand it fully in a way. The first thing which has started at this point is a requirement for companies that have met certain criteria to declare themselves, to declare the number of users they have, to qualify as a very large online platform. Many companies are coming back saying, I don't have the detailed regulation, how to know whether how should account for all those users. In a way, there was this willingness to demonstrate agility in implementing this framework. So companies have declared the figures. In some cases, some companies have sent figures to the Commission saying, well, depending how you account for users, I have different numbers. Those are my numbers. And we expect the Commission to come back with a first set of companies declaring you are VLOPs, and then saying, coming back maybe with another document saying, okay, let's clarify now the fine-tuning of the system. And in the second row, they will declare other people as a very large online platform. So you can look at it saying it's unclear, or you can look at it saying, no, it's agile, and we learn as we move forward. And there was also a really clear political willingness to say we need a regulation now, not in 2 years. Maybe we can improve it by negotiating it 2 years and 2 additional years, but the policymakers, they said, no, we want text now, and we will adapt it, and they have left freedom in the text so that it can be fine-tuned and adapted to the reality, which I think is very much fit for purpose, given that the digital economy is continuously evolving. So it's also a guarantee that we won't have to go back to Parliament every other day, which would have been a nightmare for the digital industry.
And then when it comes to the fact it's at European level, so how much are the mechanism to discuss among regulators and the European Commission, how much is this, I mean, quite already, I mean, you have a lot of experience in working this way with other regulators, or is this something that is quite new and will have to be fine-tuned over time? I mean, how innovative is this coordination among the regulators?
We have plenty of EU networks of regulators. We have it in electronic communication, in energy, in transport, in privacy regulation, in audiovisual media regulation. Each network is slightly different. In a way, it will be the most integrated network we have ever seen. I think the closest thing would be nearly what we have with the central banks, where you have a central bank, an EU central bank in the center, a national central bank in every member state, and they really operate as a network of regulators. That's exactly the same thing here. We have the EU Commission, and now the next step is for each member state to decide who will be the implementing authorities. We may have several of them to implement which part of the DSA, and one of them in each country will be designated as a digital service coordinator to be at the cornerstone of helping the network to operate on a national basis, because many people will be involved on a national basis, and operate as a network at the EU level.
Okay. Thank you. So to give you some guidance, and I see that there are already discussions going on in the chat, and you should definitely use this this feature to exchange among you, and then we'll take some of the questions for the discussion. So we'll have then the 2 other presentations will last approximately the same time, like 10-15 minutes. We will have slides. This webinar is recorded, so it will be available next week on INCYBER. The media that is our partner, and so you will, for the technical parts and all the detail, then you will be happy to have the video recording and then the slides from Jean-Sébastien and from Victor. So Jean-Sébastien, will over to you now. So you are a partner at Momentum Avocats. You advise trust and safety platforms. So you will drive us through the specific requirements of the DSA. And so over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, thanks to the Trust and Safety Forum, FIC and Renaissance Numérique for hosting this event. Well, I was given the task to present you with the basics of the DSA so that, well, you can understand what it is and basically, hopefully, how to address it, how to start your compliance process, potentially. So I'll be giving you some overview, and we'll review a quick checklist of the different requirements. And we can go then further into detail thanks to your questions after the discussion is launched. So can you move to the next slide, please? So overview, checklist, and a few words about the specifics of the very large online platform and search engines regimes. So as far as the overview is concerned, can go to the next slide. Yeah. So the few basics, just to understand whether the DSA applies to your service. That's probably the first question to ask. And the first thing to raise probably is the fact that the scope of the DSA it relates to depends on the criteria related to the location of the recipients of the service, of the users. So what's important to understand is that whether or not your company is established on the EU territory, you will have to comply with the DSA. Well, quickly highlighting that, as Mr. Loutrel mentioned it, in the DSA, we keep the basics of the e-commerce directive, meaning the key principle related to the limited liability regimes. So that's something to keep in mind. And also another basic of the e-commerce directive, which is the prohibition of general obligation of monitoring the content. So that's important. And the main things which are new with the DSA are the due diligence obligation, which are specific to different categories of intermediary service that you can see on the left side of these slides. Each category we come back to this, have specific requirements to comply with. But as you can see on the slide, it's a kind of different boxes, and when you're an intermediary service, then the way you can also be a hosting service, and a hosting service can also be an online platform. It can also be a marketplace. So the first thing is to determine whether or not you're in the scope and which category of service you are providing according to the definition of the DSA. And then you have the biggest, the most essential platform, which are designated under this terminology, very large online platform or very large search engines. And to determine whether or not you belong to this category, Mr. Loutrel mentioned it, you have to determine how many users you have and whether or not basically you're above 45 million users or not. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it's just to illustrate. I won't go into the details of each obligations, but it's just to illustrate why you need to determine in which categories you belong to. And on the next slide, you'll see that to these ones, yeah. So the categories in blue, they are the categories that were the category of services that were there since the beginning, since the proposition of the draft DSA. So they are intermediaries, hosting services, I mentioned it, online platforms, and very large online platforms. And in the course of the discussion, new categories were added, and to these categories corresponds a set of requirements and obligation. These are the search engines, very large search engine, and the marketplaces, which are basically online platforms, thanks to which you can propose distant contracts with traders. So that shows you why you need to determine the category, and then to which requirement you must start. You must prepare to be compliant with. So that's for the overview. Then, once you know which category you belong to, I guess what you need is a kind of checklist and have a look at the different requirements. So that's what I try to show in the next few slides. First, you have to know that few requirements apply to any intermediary services. So, and among those ones, so you can see there's the requirements to designate a single point of contact. There's a obligation to update your terms and conditions in light of the requirements of the DSA. anticipating transparency obligation, which is a key obligation as it was mentioned before, and cooperation with the law enforcement authorities. But I'll stop there on the second column, because just to highlight that, again, if you're not established in the union, then you'll have to designate a legal representative in one of the member states, so that actually you know which authority will monitor your compliance. So this is only for services which are not established on the EU territory, but it has strong consequences because it determines which authority you will be interacting with, and also because the legal representative can be directly liable for non-compliance. So that's maybe a hard choice. So then we can move to the next slide and have a look at the obligations which are specific to hosting providers. I'll come back to the notice and action mechanism because it's a big part of it, and the provision of information to user. Here, I will just stop on something that is not very much commented related to the DSA. It's this obligation to report to the law enforcement authorities any content when you have a reasonable reason to believe that there is criminal offense that may be involved, criminal offense that may involve a threat to the life or safety of persons. So this is also an aspect of DSA to reinforce, to streamline the cooperation with law enforcement authorities, and that must not be forgotten, I would say. Then next slide is about the platforms. So again, you can see there are specific obligations which are cumulative with the one we just went through. So various obligations, we can come back to this through your questions afterwards. We just mention and the prohibition of dark patterns, for example. This is something very new. For example, in France, there's the anti-fraud authority has a lot of focus on this. It's also interesting to note that pretty recently there's a case from the European Court in a case involving Amazon, which did not enforce DSA, of course, but which relied also on the same issue. Related to the fact that the user of a platform is not clearly able to identify the origin of the offer, for example. And this is something which is quite important in the DSA, because as you can see on Article 25, this kind of dark patterns, they are prohibited. And this is an issue where we can expect guidelines and clarification from the different authorities and the Commission. And also for the marketplaces, it may be a cause for not being able to rely on the limited liability regime. So that's an example of a key provision that in my sense needs to be spotted here. There's also obligation related to the prohibition of certain types of targeted advertising for minors or for everyone when they are based on sensitive data in the sense of the GDPR. And again, specific obligation of transparency related to advertising and recommender system. So if you try to summarize all this, we can go to the next slide, and you'll see that one key aspects of the DSA is this, meaning the notice and action mechanism, because it's kind of the engine that any platform must build in order to reinforce the moderation of the illicit content, and to comply with the due diligence obligations. And if you try to, what we try to do on this slide is just to streamline the different obligation from the notice mechanism to the measures against misuse, through the need to, for example, to provide information about the reason why you remove a content, the fact that you need to acknowledge receipt of any notification, the fact that you need to set up an appeal to your decision, to the decision of the platform, or also you need to make available an out-of-court dispute settlement mechanism so that your users, they can rely on this if they're not happy as a result of your internal process. Again, we can come back to this thanks to your question, and I'll be happy to answer any question you may have. But that should give you some kind of overview of all the obligation. I'm just mentioning that there are specific obligations for marketplaces, but I won't be longer on this because I just want to take 1 more or 2 minutes to focus on VLOPs. So VLOPs, you understood it. If you're above 45 million users, you may be VLOPs or a very large search engine. So what does it mean? Well, it means that it was suggested before, you have to comply with a specific regime. Maybe the heart of this regime being this obligation to proceed to risk assessment on a regular basis. And of course, it reminds you of the compliance regime or the compliance process that you implement for GDPR compliance, because you do your audits, your risk assessments, and then you consider corrective measures, and these go on every year. And in addition to this, there's a list of specific obligation on the right side of the slide, which involves basically more stringent obligation, which comes in addition to the one we just went through. For example, the transparency requirements, which will be stronger for VLOPs in comparison to the one of non-VLOPs platforms. So I hope this gives you a great overview, and we can discuss this into details. Thanks to your question. Thanks.
Thank you, Sébastien. Yes, there was a question already on the illegal content and child abuse and hate, and that will be something I guess we will discuss longer. I would just like to take a technical, question that was asked about the e-commerce directive. So what happens to it? Is it?
It's still there. It's still, the DSA is without prejudice of the e-commerce directive. Which may sound a bit weird, actually, because typically, if you look at the definition of the hosting provider, cache provider, or things like that, they are in both.
At the end of the DSA, you have an article which cancels those articles of the e-commerce directive.
Okay.
The definition and the limited liability scheme of the e-commerce no longer exists.
Okay.
It has been transferred to the DSA.
Okay.
So the DSA is a direct regulation and also a corrigendum of the e-commerce directive.
Okay, understood. Sorry for that. But for the rest, it's without prejudice. It's in.
You have to take both, but you have one part which has disappeared in e-commerce and reappeared, and typically that's why I was mentioning that the limited liability scheme of intermediaries has been strengthened.
Yeah.
Because it's no longer part of e-commerce. It's
it's actually a great benefit, as you highlighted it, because it's a regulation, so it's stronger, harmonized, and it created lots of issue through Europe. So it's certainly a good thing for platforms, hosting providers, and intermediaries.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we are on time. So now for the third presentation, before then we have a long Q&A session. So with Louis-Victor de Franssu, CEO and founder of Tremau. Tremau is, as I said, a trust and safety solution provider. So we discussed about the big picture, then the specific obligations, and now we are going with Louis Victor to understand, okay, how do we do it in practice? And or can you comply by yourself, or do you need support? And this is exactly what Tremau will tell us about. So Louis Victor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and thank you to the Trust and Safety Forum of FIC and to Renaissance Numérique for organizing this event. This is very timely. It's exactly 1 month. This discussion is very timely. It's exactly 1 month after the official publication or the obligation to publish the monthly active users for each of the platforms, and it's 11 months away from the official deadline or for the entry into force of the Digital Service Act for every single online service operating in Europe. As both Benoit and Jean-Sébastien mentioned, the very large online platforms and very large online search engines will need to comply by sometimes spring, summer of this year. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Commissioner Breton actually mentioned that the latest would be 1st of September. So the obligations are coming quite quickly. You spoke about risk assessments. For the VLOPs, there'll be the obligation of completing the first version of the risk assessment before then. And so it's going to be quite quick now until companies need to be ready. And of course, as you can imagine, if you just switch slides, and I'll jump that slide if you could go to the next one as well. Thank you. As you can imagine, it's not going to be easy. I mean, Jean-Sébastien, you mentioned all the different obligations, and you had the very good slide where you showed every impact that the DSA will have on your moderation process, on the platform's moderation process. And you see it's not easy, because it's not only about making sure that you detect the content. It's also, what do you do with the content once you've detected it? And that's a big paradigm shift. We're moving away, as Benoit mentioned, from an obligation of results to an obligation of means. And the regulators can now come and say, okay, show me that you have put in place every single tool, process, policies, procedures to comply with the regulation, to protect your users. And that is going to be quite complex. It's going to be quite complex because, as Benoit mentioned, it's no longer just the legal text you have to comply with. It's also going to be best practices. It's going to be, what are the codes of conduct that are going to come out? What are the different elements that the industry is going to be also preparing and making available for the wider market. This paradigm shift is going to push companies to review the way in which they approach content moderation, as I was saying. It's going to force them, especially given the amount of fine, because we've spoken a lot about the obligations, but we haven't mentioned yet that it's failure to comply is 6% of global annual turnover, or up to 6% of global annual turnover, which is absolutely massive as a fine or potential fine. It's going to push platforms to really rethink the way in which they moderate the content on their platform. It's going to push them to ensure that they have overall visibility of the entire process, making sure that they can know how many user reports they've received, how many user reports they've actually looked at, how many are pending, how many reports or flags have come out of an AI tool or a trusted flagger or a law enforcement agency. How much time does it take to respond? How many times did you, once you close a case or flag that you receive from a user report, how many times did you have an appeal mechanism? How do you automate the issues of statements of reasons? How do you then make sure that those statements of reasons can be sent to the EU Commission? Because that's part of the obligations of transparency. It's sending all your statements of reasons to the Commission in a way that's anonymized. How do you do that? How do you automatize these elements? It's not what's going to make it even more complex is that, so you have all these new obligations and you see the current environment. And at Tremau, as Jean-Christophe was mentioning, we've been working with a number of companies, both in advising them, but also in providing the platforms and the tools for them to be able to do so, is we see that the number of tools that are being used for this moderation process in a number of our clients or a number of platforms on the market is great. So in the sense that you see some platforms using 6, 7, 8 different tools to moderate the process. And I'm even speaking of some VLOPs that have many, many different tools. And so if you want to do a transparency report at the end of the year, or if you want to say, okay, that many user reports led to that many appeals, how do you aggregate those? How do you make those links one another? Well, if you're using completely different tools that don't speak to each other, that haven't been built to be optimized and to increase the efficiency of the process is just not possible. And it becomes a burden. And by the way, one thing which I think is also very important to note is that the Digital Services Act is a fundamental shift, but it's only a beginning of an increase in regulatory scrutiny across Europe and across the globe. I mean, we're speaking today, there's a terrorist content online regulation, which is also live. There's discussion in the EU framework around the CSAM regulation. There's discussions in the UK on the online safety bill. And all of these have direct impact on the way platforms moderate the content, on the way the processes are operated. So I spoke about the need to have a global oversight, or the need for companies to be able to know where they stand in terms of their moderation and where they stand in terms of the moderation process. They need to, the difficulty of having a number of tools. And now another difficulty is also the multiplication of sources of detection. You have to integrate your user reports. You have to integrate trusted flaggers. You need to start working with law enforcement across 27 member states potentially. You have all these different detection tools that you also have to be able to integrate and to include in your transparency reporting. Transparency reporting, which is being able to tell how your sources of detection are working. If you have an AI tool, being able to justify how well your tool is working. And it's not only about saying, okay, this is the amount of cases where the tool gave me a proposed action and I took the action, but how often is it aligned, is the label aligned with the policy? So it's actually being able to give statistical analysis on the functioning of the AI detection tools, which is something which is also going to be specific, very complex for a number of companies. Also, we very briefly mentioned the trusted flag organizations. Trusted flag organizations, which is a new role in the trust and safety ecosystem, will have a specific role and will have an obligation of also providing transparency reporting. So as an online platform, not only are you issuing your own transparency reports, but potentially you have a trusted flagger that's issuing to the regulators a transparency report saying, I sent 10 requests to platform A and they never responded. And so it's not only the scrutiny and based of like what you are providing, but it's also an increase of the number of people looking and providing, I want to say maybe checks and balances or an overview of how effective you actually are in moderating the content on your platform. And finally, there's also a big push on the DSA, which is to say, it's all good to say, okay, your platform, and you say, okay, these are my terms of services, fine. Now the regulator can go in and say, actually, are you applying those terms of services? Are you actually doing what you say you're doing? And so you need to make sure that this, that your processes and the policies you have in place to operationalize your moderation process are in fact in line with what you say you do. So as you can see, there's a number of very operational implications of these obligations. And from our experience and expertise in working with a number of platforms, it's something which will require significant work from a number of platforms in the ecosystem. I want to I wouldn't say I do an overarching integration of what Benoit and what Jean-Sébastien said, but you said a number of very good points, which is what do you need to do in order to comply with the DSA? Well, first of all, you need to understand your obligations. You need to work with Momentum to understand what are your obligations exactly, what you need to be able to comply with, what you need to comply with. You need then also to have a very holistic approach to content moderation and compliance. It's no longer, as I said at the beginning, about simply, and I say simply because quote because we know it's difficult, about detecting the content. It's also about saying, what am I doing with this content once it's been detected? You need to update your processes, your tools. You need to make sure that those tools are up to date. And you need to make sure that these tools are built to increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of your trust and safety operations in general. This is specifically complex for the moment, given that we're in an environment where we're looking more at cost reduction, or the market is looking more at cost reduction and downsizing teams rather than increasing costs or implementing new tools or developing new tools. But in fact, I believe it's also an opportunity because at the end of the day, ensuring that your users are safe is also protecting your user base. And a lot of the moderation process, a lot of the way moderations is done today could be improved, or there's significant areas for a possible enhancement and increase in effectiveness and efficiency. And these are cost reductions in a sense, in making your tools more efficient, making your processes more efficient, making sure that you can do more with less. And that's what I suggest, and taking Benoit's word, which is if you don't have a trust and safety department, now is the time to do so. And try and capitalize on this to actually, take this opportunity to go one step further and actually make sure that you can have this global oversight and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of your processes. This can also give significant, I'd say, advantage to you. I'd say, imagine you are an online platform with multiple services, okay? And if you are able to have, live global oversight of how your different games are doing in terms of moderation, you can also start saying or seeing, in my service A or in my product A, I'm seeing an increase in that type of content or that type of harassment or etc. And so you could say, okay, there I need to implement that tool, or there I need to review the way I protect minors online on that service. And it also gives you insight. You can capitalize and leverage this to give you insight and improve the way in which you're actually operating your platform, operating your services, and so better protect your users in general, and also increase the number of users you have on the platform. I think that's kind of in a nutshell what I wanted to say around some of the operational implications of this text. This text, which is very complex, I think it's 102 pages in total of regulation, and it's, as both Benoit and Jean-Sébastien said, a regulation that sometimes is a bit can seem a bit vague because there's a lot of additional elements that are going to come with in the weeks, months, and years to come. And so lots of work to be done, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have on these.
Thank you, Loutrel. We do have questions, and I try to summarize them, and then this will probably generate more questions. So, when you look at this context, and I know we start with the very large platforms, but when you look at the technologies that are available, most of them are cloud-based. It's not like in the old time when you had to recreate everything locally. So now, basically, number of companies are going to, including you, Tremau, are going to offer a range of solutions online. So my first question would be, okay, I know we start with a very large platform, but very large platforms also have a massive number of issues. They have for the largest one, they have tens of thousands of moderators, so super complex processes, while smaller players, actually, they have a much manageable workforce, and if they use cloud-based services, they may actually be in a much better situation. So, and question to the three of you, actually, do you think that the very large platform, are they really in a better situation, better place to be the first one to start? Or would the smaller players actually, okay, they're smaller, they have less resources, but they also have less problems, and maybe the DSA would be less difficult for them to implement. So what's your assessment of the challenge for who is going to suffer the most or struggle the most to implement the DSA, the largest or the smallest? And then you can, because the three of you have different views, so I guess it would be a question for each of you. Maybe you can start with you, and then Jean-Sébastien, and then finish by Benoit.
One thing I would say is 11 months to implement all that has to be implemented is in fact very short. So you might think that because it's in 2024, for the smaller platforms, it's a long time, and it's tomorrow. Like, that's something that really needs to be understood, I think. Second, VLOPs, it's difficult to put them all in the same basket, because there's some companies that have been developing best practices, that have been developing centralized moderation tools. I'm just thinking, for example, of what Meta has been developing over the years, and have very strong processes and tools in place. You have some that don't. So it's be very difficult to say upfront like this and say like it's one category versus the others. The other thing I'd say is the obligation for VLOPs is going, one step further. For example, we spoke about the risk assessments. Risk assessments is a very new obligation in this ecosystem, and a lot of the developers still need to understand, like, what does this mean concretely? How do I need to operationally conduct this risk assessment? And then second step of the risk assessment is the audit, independent audit. How are these independent audits going to be done? How are these auditing companies going to do it? So, but if I answer your question in terms of if I'm only looking at the obligations for online platforms, are the big companies better off than the small companies? Not specifically, no. I think it really depends on the maturity of the company, of the maturity of your processes, and the flexibility you have to build and to implement new ones. There's of course a lot of issue, like in any company, around legacy system. If sometimes you build and you grow, you build one block above the other, and you don't have the data. It's very difficult to find. It takes a lot of time to do the transparency reporting. I was speaking to one company that says it takes them basically 6 months to do a transparency reporting, report on what they need to do for the DSA. So it really depends the tools and the processes you have in place.
So actually, good point. That a new player, a new company may save a lot of energy and effort, because they would not have to reinvent or rebuild the infrastructure. Is this something that has been taken into consideration? I'll ask you this question maybe last, if this question makes sense. So when you advise your client, because you have a range of clients, so
well, I would say that shortly that the VLOPs, I guess, they're supposed to be already kind of ready for this. Or at least I would say that the ones, if you're a VLOP, meaning that you have 45 million users on the European territory, and you're totally out, it's quite worrying, because it means, frankly, that you missed something these last years, that there's something wrong. And especially because for the platforms, but to the contrary, I think that the platforms, and especially the ones who cares for brand protection and brand safety, well, they may already have a lot done already, even if adjustments will be required, and even if Louis Victor is totally right, there's something new. It's the risk assessment. It's the big compliance process in itself. So when you're under the 45 millions, but you're big, then you may have a lot to do. But I mean, it's a compliance process. I guess what we see within our client is that even if they don't have a trust and safety function, which happens quite often, but even if they don't, they have people which are familiar with compliance, with processes, with quality. And these people, in my experience, that these people, they are able to address these kind of compliance obligation and requirements, which stems from the DSA. So I'm don't want to be too optimistic, but I guess that the expertise required, to me, is quite close to the expertise required for any kind of compliant process. You mentioned the bank, we mentioned GDPR. Obviously, the substance of the rights which are protected are different, but I mean, in terms of managing a compliance process, you may have the people within, or you may find them outside anyway. And the last word on this is that, SMEs, they benefit from few exceptions and derogations, so they may have to comply, but with lighter regimes.
Well, I guess it's not a question of whether you are big or small. If you are big and you are not serious in terms of trust and safety, if you have ignored the fact that this regulation was coming and the whole process was public, yes, you are in a difficult situation. And we have been on the record at ARCOM saying that we are worried typically of what is the current status of a platform like TikTok, where there is a discrepancy between the success from a commercial point of view and where they are from a trust and safety point of view. So clearly, we are saying publicly they will have a lot of work to catch up on this situation, and we do expect that the DSA will put a lot of pressure on them. At the same time, for small companies, if you were genuinely implementing a trust and safety function, I'm not sure you will have that much to change. In a way, you will have to maybe to add some new processes to organize the reporting. But basically, the things which are required, most of them are common sense for people who are implementing genuinely trust and safety.
Can I just a quick word, if you're done? Yeah, sorry. I think that, well, as it was mentioned by you both, actually, the DSA is not an end in itself, meaning that if you want to know how to comply, you need to know what will be the implementation acts, the delegated acts, the guidelines, the code of conduct, and that's where well, we can hope that the Commission and the authorities they'll maybe speed up things, because it's true that in some areas, unless we have these guidelines, these delegated acts, well, it's more difficult to comply. It's not, well, we probably can start trying to comply, but it's difficult to comply when you don't know exactly what will be in the delegated act, the implementation act, etc. And there is a number of provision in the DSA that are expected to be completed with this kind of legal instruments. So that's the nuance I would add.
Something I wanted also maybe to add is the fact that there's a culture, and the EU culture of regulation, and all those regulation, the objective is not to put fines on company. It's not a financing scheme for the EU or the EU member state. The objective is to get the compliance. So, of course, if at some point you have a manifestly illegal content on your website, you have been notified, you have not taken action, yes, at some point you may have a regulator calling in saying, what are you doing? If you don't take down the content at this point, manifestly illegal, yes, you will have issues. But if it's just a question of you haven't understood correctly the regulation, the way that all those regulations that you are designed, the first thing you may receive first is a discussion with the regulator asking you to put all your house in order. You may receive a formal order to do such a thing, and only if you don't act on it, you may enter in a process where you get a fine at the end of the day. But as I used to say, in all those regulations, that's how they have been designed in the EU sectoral regulation. If you receive a fine, it's really that you were deaf or you had decided to be deaf. Because the objective is not to raise money. The objective is to increase accountability of platform. And I started from that point. It's a plugin on e-commerce. And e-commerce has been designed for the success of the platform. And we have this success. And the success is not being challenged by policymakers. We are just saying, if we want the success, and we want the accountability, and we want the increased responsibility, and it was designed to have it while you're minimizing the economic cost. So you should not be overstretched if you are, it was already a good business pattern to take care of your users and fundamental rights.
I will have a follow-up question to the three of you as well on this sense of responsibility or lack of responsibility of the platform. So one of the first regulators to be very active and public has been and is the eSafety Commissioner in Australia. And the Commissioner, Julian Mann-Grant, is quite vocal and quite open about the fact that she's not happy with the level of response that she gets from the from different platforms, and she was referring to the largest one. Question to, again, in your experience and without disclosing any name, I mean, you did disclose, refer to TikTok very clearly. When I discuss, and including with some participants on this chat, I mean, some people, I would say, in the public, in particular, people who are representing victims of child sexual abuse, for instance. But there is a sense that there is a lack of responsibility of the platforms, smaller or bigger. They feel not really supported. But when we hear from you, there is this big legal framework. So is it that and clearly there is a perception in the public that there is not enough done to, make the platform respond. You did demonstrate that actually there is quite a process and a big process in place in preparation. So now my question is, in this context, do you think that the smaller and larger platforms, do you think that they understand the seriousness of the effort they will have to make for those who are not really? Do they realize what's coming, or do you in your role do you still are in this process of educating and alerting and warning the social network and the platform that's okay? Something has to change. What is the level of? Is it they're not listening, or they are listening but they can't do? What's your And of course, different companies may have different attitudes. So your experience in so far?
Honestly, if you're qualified as a VLOps and you're not already working on the implementation of the DSA, there is a real issue. You should be worried because clearly at this point, when you have more than 45 million users in the EU and you're not aware that you have a requirement coming in, you're already late. The first requirement was to declare the number of users. That's the first thing. On the contrary, if you are under this threshold, you will only be required, the compliance officer in a way will be the national regulator. In most countries, the national regulator has not been appointed yet. We are not at this point the national regulator. It's not for us to decide. It's for the French Parliament to decide on the proposal of the French government. And they have not started they have started the process of drafting this law. They have not presented this law. We are candidate to be this regulator. We are preparing ourselves to play this role. But clearly, from my point of view, I'm starting the process today of raising awareness, thanks to Renaissance Numérique, thanks to you, to prepare people for the fact that, yes, this regulation is coming in, and each national regulator wants the fact that a law will have to be presented in Parliament in each of the member states will kickstart the process of saying, we want compliance from smaller platform in each of the member states. So for me, it's normal, and people should not be overstressed because again, it was a good business practice to have a trust and safety practice. So most businesses will be ready, and yeah, they will have to adapt, but it will not be the revolution. It mainly, I saw the question on the chat. Trust on the DSA is not changing what is legal or illegal. There's no change. It's just saying that trust and safety from now on is required by law.
Well, the VLOps and
VLOps is something different.
Something specific, and I'd like to say a word about those which are not VLOps, because at the end of the day, there's no so many VLOps so far, but there are plenty of platforms which are not, and which will need to find a way to comply with this. I think there's different ways to help the platforms actually to comply. There are instruments in the DSA which are there, which need to be set up. For example, I mentioned the out-of-court dispute settlement bodies. Well, they have to be certified by the national authority, the French one, the Italian one, but that's something that we help to comply. There's also the trusted flaggers, and my point is also about the need for these trusted flaggers to be able to offer a service which is not easy to provide. And my question is not such a legal question, but I'm also wondering about the economics of compliance and whether or not in a country like France, but it may be true for other countries, I don't know. In a country like France, there's a question of whether or not we will have organizations which are, on an economic point of view, sustainable enough to provide high quality service, or at least it's not so much a question, but I think that kind of a wish, because I'm afraid that if we take this specific mechanism as an example, I'm afraid that if we don't manage to build and to develop an ecosystem, sustainable ecosystem of trusted flagger, at the end of the day, this mechanism of trusted flagger, it could be quite frustrating, maybe generate risk, because as Louis Victor mentioned it, the trusted flagger, they will have their notices to be dealt with in priority. They will issue reports, and at the end of the day, if we don't meet high quality standard within the platforms and within the trusted flaggers, I guess my point that we may generate situation where instead of generating a culture of compliance and efficient culture, efficient processes, we come to a point where, well, the platforms, and I think it's good thing to discuss it, may receive notice that are not good, that are not relevant. And well, there are also mechanisms in DSA to manage this kind of situation, but because it's to the national authorities to set the criteria, that's interesting to discuss how we can develop this, because this is one of the tools. You mentioned the toolbox idea. This is one of the tools that is made available to platforms to help them to comply. So
maybe I guess trusted flagger is a very good example of the toolbox feature of the DSA. And trusted flagger, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the idea, or most of them are NGOs, which were created and at the initiative of big platforms. They were not called yet very large online platform. So it was an instrument invented by some platform, typically Google, Facebook, and Twitter. And the DSA is saying, well, that's a good idea, but let's professionalize it and let's mainstream the trusted flagger so that it will benefit everybody, not only the large platform, but also the small platform. So the idea is that, so the DSA also offer a framework to bring to a higher level of maturity those trusted flaggers, and to organize how they receive the signaling and how they deliver the signaling to all platforms, big or small. Yeah. So the success of the trusted flagger will be to the benefit of the small platform, because they won't have to. It will be available for them, even if they won't have the energy of the big platform to create the trusted flagger. But the regulator will step in, saying, no, work with those trusted flaggers to help them go one step higher. And the idea is really, we know that the signaling that platforms receive from end users is of low quality. So it has a cost on the platform, because we receive a lot of signaling and significant part of them is not relevant, but you still have to make the check. The signaling you receive from the trusted flagger are, on the contrary, the objective can be of very high quality. So if you receive them, say, oh, I have really to deal with it, because there's a presumption that it's really something which needs to be taken down. So it's really a win-win for everybody to have this success. Yeah. Then we'll have to be careful, because the idea is not to send everybody signaling through the trusted flagger, because the trusted flagger will not survive such a thing. But it's the idea of building specific channels that may be available to other NGOs, of a second layer of NGOs, available locally to public authorities, local governments, to really have the efficiency of handling very efficiently difficult situations. So it's a very powerful tool. We hope to really we expect to have a success with it, and to really bring a lot of value for everybody, and to, as you said, to enhance the economic model. And that's why I'm saying that the DSA is really saying, the policymakers are saying, we want the success of the digital economy, but it has to be sustainable. It has to be show respect for fundamental rights. And it's also providing instrument to make sure that we are not killing the economic model. So we are very hopeful that we can bring value. Honestly, we are really optimistic, and we are sure. We understand why so many people outside of Europe are looking at the DSA saying, this thing is interesting. it's puzzling at the beginning because yes, it's complex, but you really it takes time to understand it. It has an incredible potential.
I just on this, a couple of points was mentioned, and I think you're both completely right in terms of the professionalization of and the role that trusted flag organizations will play, and they will also have to put in place the right tools, the right processes, and that's something that is super important for the general ecosystem of the DSA. The stronger as you said, the stronger the trusted flaggers, the better and more transparent the entire ecosystem will become. And I think that's key. We at Tremau have worked with INCYBER, for example, in building out the system. I'm not saying that they're going to be a trusted flag on the DSA. It's for the regulator to decide. But it's NGOs will need to, or these trusted flag organizations will need to professionalize the way in which, or strengthen and enhance the way in which they build and have the tools and are able to do the transparency reporting. That's on the first point. Second point, which I think is very useful as well, and it goes into this idea of trying to capitalize on the text and capitalize on having to implement these new obligations to also put efficiency gains in the way companies and platforms moderate the content online. We all know that the quality of user reports is really bad. And some of the clients we work with have said even that 80% of the user reports they receive, above 80%, they just throw away. It's just irrelevant reports. Having the right tools can also enable you to educate your users little by little. And actually, it's it's in one of the articles of the DSA that you should be able to detect those that abuse of your user reporting mechanisms. So how is your process built to be able to say, okay, user A, you've been reporting 15 times content that is completely irrelevant. Next time you do so, you might be banned. Like, what is the warning messages? What are the mechanisms that are in place to be able to improve the quality of the reports and so decrease the noise and so gain in efficiency? And I think the third point I'd like to make, which was linked to something you said, Jean-Christophe, to begin your question, which is sometimes victims feel they're not answered and there's a problem of trust in the entire ecosystem. And this is where I think, and Benoit, you might confirm, the area around transparency has been such a central point of the DSA. Transparency from different actors, transparency from the platforms themselves with different levels of transparency depending on the size, transparency from the trusted flaggers, transparency from the out-of-court dispute mechanism. So there's kind of it's not the right word, but it's a bit like a checks and balances where the more transparency you inject in the ecosystem, the more relevant, the more everybody's holding the other party accountable to the work they're doing. And so the idea is really to enable the trust to grow again in this ecosystem, which, as Benoit said, is so fundamental to our economies, to the way we live. I mean, we saw it during COVID, how important online platforms have become in our general life. And so the DSA is and the processes that companies need to put in place is also a way of increasing more generally some of this trust.
And follow-up question on the trusted flaggers. I mean, some companies already have identified their trusted flaggers, some are more open. You're going to have the role to appoint or define the trusted flaggers. And then, so what will be the process? I mean, in terms of, do we already know whether there will be an open call for, okay, you believe you are a trusted flagger, then apply, or get yourself known, and then you're going to review this, or is it going to be more through discussions through the platforms, or what will be, do we know already, or is this something that will be discussed, I guess, also at the European level later? I mean, what's the process for the trusted flaggers or people, organizations who believe they are, and they may not have the right quality, or they may have? So what, do we know the process that will be, or is this something that has to be organized?
I guess we'll be pragmatic. It will be an open process. I guess we won't refuse trusted flaggers if people want to be trusted flaggers. The more the better, provided they are professional. As far as I remember, because I'm still memorizing all the articles one by one, they are designated by national regulators on a national basis, because it's really built the heart of civil society. So if you want to be, if you are, as we speak, if you are today trusted flaggers for a specific platform and want to continue to be a trusted flagger, you shouldn't continue. The idea is that we will help you be a trusted flagger, focus on an issue, but for all platforms. The idea is that you will have this capacity to do that more efficiently in the future. You have the rules in the DSA. for the Commission at some point to help formalize how the exchange of information will take place for everybody to be efficient, to set the standard so that at the end you don't have to develop an API. You will have an API in a way where you will know how to, as a trusted flagger, how to develop your system and immediately interface it with any new platform appearing in the system. So that's what you have, that's the potential of the DSA. So that we expect it will be over time a great success. That part is obvious because really it will help everybody to be efficient.
And also, I suppose that also there will be a review mechanism because trusted flagger may be very efficient at the beginning when you review them, and then 2 years later they lose funding, management change, or they may.
That's why you have the reporting. Yeah. Because clearly, trusted flagger is a promise that we recognize you as something who is reliable in its signaling. Your signaling will be prioritized by the platform. But at the end of the day, everybody will report. And if the platforms come back saying, but this specific trusted flagger has 50% of the signaling are false positive, whereas the average is 80% or is 20% false positive, we'll have a discussion with the trusted flagger. What's going on? Is that something you are not understanding? And we'll have discussion with the objective of raising this ratio so that we have a mutual benefits. If no dialogue is possible, yes, there will be some consequence.
Yeah, just a quick point. In my view, because, had this few years ago experience in different French NGOs, at least, I guess to me, the success of trusted flaggers depends a lot on the funding because, there's no area where you can build strong, sustainable expertise without sustainable funding, and it's not the work of the authority to solve this issue, but I'm quite comfortable to mention here. But I guess that in the DSS, maybe I've missed this, but there's nothing about the funding of the trusted flagger. And again, my concern, to me, it's crucial to have this trusted flagger have a strong expertise, because it helps the victims, because it helps the platforms. But I'm really questioning how we will manage to build an ecosystem, a strong ecosystem of trusted flaggers without specific funding.
Funding is a question, and it will have to be discussed. But you can imagine several families of trusted flaggers. Some trusted flaggers, in a way, are trusted flaggers of public interest. And you have some funding from the French government helping some trusted flaggers to establish themselves. You have some funding coming from platforms who support those trusted flaggers. Other trusted flaggers may be of private interest. If you notify an infringement to copyright laws, to intellectual property, those ones may have
something else. Yeah.
other schemes for funding.
For sure.
And don't expect maybe to have the same level of support from the public authorities, because clearly there's a private interest, very legitimate, but it's a private interest. In some cases, we'll have an issue of funding. I would not say it's not taken into account in the DSA. It's a question that you have to address on a national basis. So it's a room of maneuver, and clearly on those issues, we have already started working on at ARCOM, and of course we are not alone. Typically on hate speech, in a way, if I may, we are working very closely with DILCRA, which is a central government body working on those issues, and DILCRA is already providing financial support to specific trusted flaggers. That's one example.
There was a question on whether fines could be funding from fines, but I guess this is not the idea, because you said that's the purpose, to have no fines.
Exactly. No.
Because they will...
It would be a dangerous incentive. So no, don't be afraid. Fines will not be used to fund trusted flaggers, because we will have an incentive to put fines, and that's really not the idea. The scheme will work even if we don't put any fines.
There was a question from, I think, Christian Cazenave on, you alluded to this having a kind of overview at the national level, and this is, I think, work which is being done by the Conseil National de la Refondation, or the National Council of Refondation, there's some discussion about trying to understand how this fits into the overall regulation, and also with cybersecurity funding. I mean, is this what they do, or?
Conseil National de la Refondation is a process, is a dynamic in a way. It's not a body. It's a political initiative from the government. One part of it is focusing on digital issues, and one part of it is focusing on how you pacify the digital space. And Jean Catan, who is a General Secretary of Conseil National du Numérique, we are working closely with him. And the idea is to raise awareness locally outside of Paris, because France is not Paris, to understand whether to stimulate initiative, to get feedback from the field, and it will fit. We are working hand in hand with him.
So I have a last question, and then there was maybe a question on the class actions, but I have to find it again in the chat. It's not easy, so that's why if the participant could type it again. There will be a lot of discussions on the technologies used to actually detect and moderate content and so on. So you will be probably, whether you are on the helping side or whether on the regulator side, you are going to have questions like, okay, I have a great technology is super efficient, use AI and everything. And there will be a lot of discussion about whether the platforms use proper technologies or inefficient technologies and so on. So how are you going to, and there will be a lot of lobbying and try to convince you of the beautiful things that these companies do. And there will be arguments between the platforms who use certain technologies and the sellers, the providers of technologies. How is this going to be playing? And you, in Tremau, you are likely to implement some technologies and maybe not others to do the moderation. And you as a regulator, ARCOM, then you will probably have questions and discussions. So how are you going to address this?
The regulation is neutral in terms of technology. You don't have anything, as far as I know, in the DSA that will tell us to pick and choose the technology. Because it's really this idea that with the DSA, we don't want to break up the internet. Yeah. We don't want to limit the use of technology. At the end of the day, we just want to have the effectiveness of the moderation if we are discussing technology which are used for moderation purposes. We don't expect to stabilize the technology from that point of view. So really, I don't think we should have an issue on that part.
No, but let's say, the example would be, let's say the platform say, okay, I can block X number of images, and then someone tell you, if you were using another family of technology or another thing, you would block many more. Or there was this question from Mark Polman on the hate speech. So if you have discussion about using different technology may produce better result, but then you find yourself in a tricky situation. So
one way of seeing this is the regulation is an obligation of mean. It focuses on the process. So if the tool you're using, the industry knows, or the transparency reports, because remember in the transparency report, you need to show the effectiveness of the
exactly.
tool you use. If the industry, the best practice of transparency reports that you're not using a tool that is up to the level to what is best practice, what's standard, and potentially you are putting yourself at risk. That doesn't mean you are 100% at risk. It doesn't mean, etc. It means that you'll have to prove to the regulators that you've done what it takes to be compliant. If you're using a tool that is known to be outdated, or that the transparency reports are saying, it's only 50% accurate, or I don't know, there's many ways of detecting, then potentially you're putting yourself at risk. The one thing I'd say around the tools and technology you mentioned is that the DSA is in fact effectively also creating new segments of the solution provider market. Before, the issue was very centered around detection. like, how do you detect this content? How do you, what is the AI? What are the rule-based engine? How do you detect that this is hate speech, this is child sexual abuse, this is terrorist content, this is, counterfeit good, etc. Now there's a new segment, which is how do you process the information, the content that's been detected? How do you process your user reports? How do you make sure that it's effective? How do you build in your policies effectively in a process that, so somebody has, like, it's the 10th time they're abusing of your system. How do you effectively, make sure that the decision or that the action taken on the users evolves over time as well? And those are, that's a new segment of technology that's being developed right now. This is one of the technologies that we provide at Tremau, and we see others doing the same as well.
Okay.
At this point, we don't have an industry standard. We don't know yet what are the best practice. And that's, it will appear over time with the DSA.
Yeah.
Because of the transparency feature, some of people will have a capacity to benchmark themselves together. At some point, yes, the EU Commission with the national regulators maybe will start saying, oh, now that we see where is the potential, we will start setting the minimum threshold. Say, we know we can ask you this level of performance because we know it can be achieved based on what we are seeing. Exactly. And slowly, that's why I'm saying DSA is about professionalizing the trust and safety function. And I think it will help the structure of the industry, first thing. Second thing, we will start with the big players. They will be the one bearing the cost, the VLOPs. And it will help everybody understand what we can expect and then formulate reasonable expectation for smaller players. That's this idea of starting with the big guys. Yeah, it will have a cost, but if you have 45 million users, you have more capacity to deal with those issues. And we will see the standard appear in this first step. And then we will mainstream it to other players.
And just to so then final words, and then if someone can take the last question from on class actions, that's a hard one. Okay, thank you. So then we will have the final words and the final comments from Victor and then Jean-Sébastien.
Yeah. I just and this is in one minute. We saw a lot of this happening in other industries, as you mentioned. So we look at the financial industry for anti-money laundering, for example. Tools keep getting better. Yeah. If you look at the tools 10 years ago and the tools today, and every day there's a new startup coming in anti-money laundering with new technology, with new AI, and the industry is getting better and better and better without the rules having fundamentally changed. And that's what's really impressive, and that's what is so innovative.
It's a model.
Yeah.
The model is the financial sector. Yeah. We are trying to replicate it in the digital industry, and hopefully it will be less expensive because the digital industry is less rich than the financial sector.
Okay. Well, two or three things. Well, we're lawyers, but we see the technologies used by our clients and how they handle them. So there's two or three things, I guess, to say. First thing that I guess on platform point of view, the technology must be cost efficient. Again, it's an economy of compliance. It's cost, it's resources that are allocated to this, not to innovation. So for a whole bunch of platforms, it's important to have cost-efficient technologies, which leads to the second point you mentioned, the state of the art. And it's true that there's a legal aspect here because the due diligence will be appreciated in light of the state of the art. So obviously, the sooner we have an idea of what is the state of the art, the sooner we can make sure, well, we are within our due diligence obligation. The third thing that I would advise to make sure your technology is transparent by design, because we didn't went into detail of this, but in the DSA, there's a lot of requirements related to the transparency of your technologies, your algorithm, your moderation systems. And the last point will be technology. That's what we see when working with our client. It's not all. It can't be 100% AI, in my experience, with VLOPs, with smaller, with middle range platforms. So technology is great, but it must it must be very user friendly, including the users which are within the platforms and which are reviewing when it's needed, because the technology will not be enough. Why it's sometimes not enough, and we didn't mention it but it's important to stress that DSA, it addresses all types of illegal content, which makes a lot of different types of content to be able to analyze, to qualify, to take the actions required, and we discussed today. So that's complex. That may be complex.
Can I add one word? Manifestly.
Yes.
Manifestly illegal.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
We are not expecting platform to take down content where we are not sure whether it's illegal or not.
Yeah.
Illegal or legal, only the judge can tell you ex post. Platforms are acting ex ante. Ex ante, you work on manifestly illegal or not. The word manifestly is strategic because that's where the freedoms lies, and it was repeatedly introduced by a French constitutional court. Manifestly illegal. If I can add,
Thanks for stressing it.
If I can add maybe a couple of, so the class action, as far as I understand the question, you don't have, in the DSA, you have a new obligation for platforms subject to administrative fine that can be levied by regulators with up to certain level of your worldwide turnover. So yes, at some point you'd better comply because it can be pretty aggressive if need be. But still, you can have litigation in civil courts, and then it will be in the country where the litigation takes place. And in some countries, you have a wide scope for class action, but it's really different from one country to the other. You have a scheme in France which is rather limited compared to what you will have in the US. But I don't think, as far as I know, that the DSA will change anything on that part. The last thing maybe I wanted to say is that we expect two industries, in fact, to appear with the trust and safety, regarding trust and safety as an impact of the DSA. An advisory industry, advising company how to handle the trust and safety function to the extent the trust and safety function is internalized by the platform. That's what VLOPs are doing. But we also expect that a trust and safety industry will appear providing the service to software as a service in a way, trust and safety as a service to smaller platform to allow a compliance in a very cost-effective way. And where you will then have you will develop just an API to plug in the trust and safety function that will be provided to you as a service. And because again, it's DSA is a very interesting regulation, bringing the capacity to deal with expectation from policymakers regarding EU fundamental rights, but not trying to punish the economy, not trying to punish the innovation. We are trying to combine both because, the digital world is a huge success in Europe, and we want it to continue in a way which respects fundamental rights. And one question was, why would you select France as a country to establish your business? Because the weather is good. We have Paris, we have an incredible tourism, and the regulator is not crazy. Please be our guest. If you have questions, last thing maybe, Trust and Safety Forum will take place in Lille on April 5th.
Yes.
We'll have another session on trust and safety. I would be dying that if people have more questions they have not expressed today, if they can send them to the organizers, so that will help me address directly those questions in the second event. If we have professional association, Fédération Professionnelle, who are interested in discussing those issues with ARCOM, please be my guest, send me a request. We'll be happy to have this discussion and in a very positive way. And I hope you are hearing that we are optimistic on the fact that DSA is a very good regulation, and we expect to create a lot of value for the companies and from the general public for the success of the digital world in the EU.
Thank you for this beautiful conclusion. Thank you very much, Benoit. No, you're welcome. Thank you, Louis Victor and Jean-Sébastien. So next step will be the Trust and Safety Forum, second edition. Caroline Humer our co-founder just published some information. So this video will be uploaded on INCYBER next week. So stay tuned. And with this, thank you very much. And I'll see you in Lille. And yes, we are available. I mean, you have your LinkedIn profile. So any questions, we'll be happy to help Caroline and myself. And then you can also reach out to these gentlemen directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.